Do you know anyone who's ever committed murder? What's the story? Guy across the hall was a cool guy. Super laid back. Worked a restaurant and always brought us leftover food, which was cool cause we were all poor college students. Used to go over there and play retro video games and drink beers. He'd always tell us about his girlfriend who was so busy with school he hardly saw her. Never thought much about it. Turns out she dumped him a while back and he'd been stalking her. Ended up going to her house one night and very brutally murdering her while she was on the phone with her parents. Sentenced to life in prison. So I was newly pregnant and meeting the rest of my family-in-laws during a holiday gathering. I met the aunt who used to be a rising star in LA as a model featured in magazines. If I recall correctly, she spent 17 years in prison because she was a drug mule transporting drugs during her modeling gigs. Anyway, I also met her boyfriend. He was charming and my 6-year-old son loved him. Heck, even I was swooned by his charisma. When I left the family dinner, I was informed he was recently out of prison because he murdered 2 men and placed them into barrels before dumping them into the sea. Eyes. Maybe he's a changed man? A year later, I realized I haven't heard about this man in a while. When I asked the in-laws, there was a sudden silence. That's when I found out he murdered another man and tried dumping the body with the same method. You'd think he would have learned his lesson by now. Awkward part is, he left behind a barrel in the house where I'm staying at. It took me 2 years before I pried it open out of curiosity. It was camping gear, thank you baby Jesus. I knew a man years ago, who killed a man in a bar fight. He hit the person in the head with a pool ball. He was tried and convicted of negligent homicide and served 18 months in prison. I knew him 15 years later and he had never been arrested for anything since and freely admitted he was wrong. It was a heat of the moment thing. He said he never thought it would have killed someone. I met a lady one time who told me her husband had abused her for years before she got away from him. She had a restraining order and kept a weapon on her due to being scared of not in a position to defend herself. One day she was at the gas station and he pulled up to the pump right on the other side of her. He came at her and she bent down and pulled the knife out of the holster. When she came up, she stabbed him in the heart from under his ribs. He died and she walked free. One of the most intelligent men I knew, my former boss, R, passed away of old age last year. When he was 16, which would have been in the 1940s. His mostly absentee, degenerate, doper father showed up, took R's younger sister in the garage, and beat her most bloody with a belt. R arrived just in time to roll up the garage door and told the old man, "You ever touch her again, I'll kill you." The next day after school, he comes home to hear his sister screaming in the garage. He goes in the house, grabs dad's shotgun, rolls up the door, tells sis to run, and shoots and kills the sumbitch. R was taken to juvie till trial. Sister was sent to live with an aunt. At trial, the local Baptist pastor told the small-town judge he and his wife would legally adopt R. Judge declared the killing justified, and R grew up safe and loved, and got a degree in psychology. He told me the adoptive parents were his real parents. My best friend in high school had a boyfriend who creeped me the fuck out. I had been slowly removing myself from our friendship because of his influence when I got a call from her telling me that he was on his way to pick her up and that he'd murdered his parents. I told her to hang up and call 911. His mom survived multiple gunshots. Sadly his dad did not. My father killed my mother and made it look like a suicide. He admitted it to my sister after he had a stroke and lost his ability to filter his mouth. She was getting 100% disability from the Veterans Administration, as was he. He liked to spend his money on beer and hookers. Saw him once when she was hospitalized. Wanted her to cover the bills. He got nearly as much in a widower's benefit from the VA as she was getting for disability. He was bragging the day before the funeral about how much he would be getting. Who does that? He was so greedy and sadistic. I knew he did it all along. He'd abuse my mother to the point that she would break down and have to be hospitalized for up to a year. She was disabled due to having contracted malaria during WWII in the Philippines and having a high fever that normally kills, but in her case she survived with severe nervous system problems. Very sensitive and vulnerable. He sent her to the hospital many times in the 14 years that they were married and forged his name to her savings where the VA had deposited her checks previously while she was hospitalized. He stole her money every time. And yet the police believed him when he lied and said he never abused her or anyone else. He would beat all of us when we lived with him. My grandmother hired an attorney to go talk to the investigators several months after the funeral, but they said the case was closed and refused to hear anything. My uncle had a psychotic break and stabbed my aunt to death, drugged his 2 young children, then forced them to jump off a cliff with him. He was totally normal, though a bit paranoid before that. Psychotic breaks are also pretty common in my family, though he's the only person to murder a human someone other than just himself. My daughter shot and killed her abusive ex-boyfriend in front of me. She had come to stay with us to get safe from him. Every day we caught him in the yard. Every day we called the cops. Every day they did nothing. When he showed up and tried to force his way into the house, daughter grabbed a gun. Told the cops she had a gun. The cops are 2 miles away. They never show. 20 minutes later he gets sick of waiting on her to give up and charges her. She shoots him at close range. I tell the police she has shot him and he is on the ground. 15 minutes later, one lone patrolman shows up, sees him on the ground and says, "What's the matter with him?" No ambulance ever showed up even though he was alive for a while after he was shot. They had a restraining order on him. We had called daily for a week. They still arrested her for killing him. You know how a grand jury meets once a month to decide if they will proceed with prosecution? They died and decide for 2 years. Then they let her go as a good shoot. They could have told us that before we spent $20,000 on a defense attorney and know we died and get the money back even though he never had to defend her. My great-grandma shot and killed her first husband. He was beating her while she was pregnant. She was tried but got off on self-defense. My late mother's boyfriend at the time. He randomly attacked and killed a woman walking her dog with his bare hands. He was caught inside of a couple days, but what really stuck with me was how he came home with his hands beat up, saying that he fell while on the hike. Obviously it was right after the murder, but we could not have known that at the time. He was completely chill in every respect while my mom helped clean him up. In retrospect it was a bit of a stretch to say it was from a hiking accident, but he sold it well and I was young and my mom would not have any reason to expect murder of all things. I'm getting ready for school and a couple cops show up to the house asking about my mom's boyfriend. He did not come home the night prior, and as this was back before the days of cell phones, she was concerned. I went to school but was pulled out early by my uncle where he told me my mom was going to let me know what was happening. I get to my aunt's house and she tells me what happened. My mom was devastated. We would see the story on the news that night and they showed his prior convictions. He was arrested several times for SA and violent crimes. We had no idea. We even met his extended family. They never said a word about his past. I don't know that we were ever in danger, but my mom and him dated for 3 years, lived together for 2 years. He thankfully was caught, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. A patient. When they were a minor, they had a mental break and killed their entire household save for 2 younger siblings in retaliation for SA. They had been institutionalized for their entire life thereafter. But when I knew them much later in their life, they were a heck of a nice person, especially when I was brand new, would tell me where supplies and whatnot were kept. would also look out for other patients on the unit and would give me a heads up if one was out of sorts. I worked with one of the Irish Scissor Sisters. They got drunk and high one night with their mem and her boyfriend. Boyfriend came on to one of them, so with encouragement from the mem, they killed him, then chopped his body up in the bathroom with a bread knife. Knew a really nice foreign guy who ran a local restaurant. He was well known and liked in the town. Found out years later he strangled his 2 kids and killed his wife before killing himself. Still can't make sense of it to this day. Hung out a bunch of times with my friend and his co-worker who lived in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. At some point it came up that several years before he was walking home and a guy tried to rob him at knife point. It turned into a scuffle and the co-worker turned the knife and drove it into the robber with what turned out to be a fatal stab wound. The cops obviously got involved. The co-worker had never been arrested while the robber had a long criminal history including violent acts, and so there were never any charges. He didn't like to talk about it though, kinda fucked him up for a good while even though he was in the right. My old barber murdered someone when he was 17 and served somewhere around 12 to 13 years. I was pretty young when he did it, but we knew each other back then. We got really cool when he started cutting my hair after he got out, but he had a negative tick to him. You could tell when he was having a bad day. We talked about anything that was going on around us, but I never asked or mentioned anything about what he did. Never talked about it at all. I said this a few times, was offered a podcast spot on here. Amen deep at all. Y'all can search it up. Her dad stabbed her over 30 times for dating white dude. If the name doesn't point to her ethnicity, she was Punjabi. The community was stunned, but not surprised. The dad was always a bit weird, but harsh. He was ingrained in family culture and self-image. How did I know her? She was my babysitter, and even if I was 5, my first crush. Her dad offered to drive her back to PG, because she had moved out, and she had spent time with her family in Vancouver, and he had offered to drive her back. He then proceeded to stab her 30 times, and claimed it was her committing suicide. She was barely entering her adult years, and he took her life to preserve his family image. He was granted a parole a few years back and was denied full parole because he hasn't shown that he has changed, and that was to say he won't integrate back into the same society characters who he based his fucked up belief in. I know a guy who ran over his girlfriend's head with his car, twice, because he thought she was cheating on him. He's serving a life sentence now. While in prison, a much older woman who worked in the kitchen fell in love with him and they married. She doesn't work there anymore. He then converted to Islam, and now whenever she visits, she has to be fully covered from head to toe. Wackos, both of them. My brother-in-law is in prison for life for killing his ex-friend with benefits who was married. It was really hard on the family, but he had a history of being mentally unstable and stalking women. For whatever reason, a local police department still hired him. When he got hired, I called the chief of chiefs in the area, who was a personal friend, told him about the stalking and erratic behavior and that he could not be trusted with a gun. No lie, 3 months later, right before Christmas, same guy calls to tell us that my brother-in-law had just confessed to murder. I haven't spoken to that friend since. He could have literally prevented this from happening, but he did nothing. Still makes me so sick to think about. He was an asshole in school. Never gave a shit about doing the right thing, always purposely pissing the teachers off. But his older brother was the opposite. Loved by everyone, an all-around goofy person, worked with little kids in his free time and after graduation. He went into his older brother's room, held a gun to his head and asked, "Are you feeling lucky?" and pulled the trigger. It was a huge loss to our community and school district. I believe the younger brother was released early from prison due to the downsizing during COVID. No idea where he is now.